A warning before we start. This episode mentions suicide and sexual violence. From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Tuesday, September 10. One of Australia's worst child sex offenders was given a redundancy by a Uniting Church childcare service with just 44 minutes of official consideration. That's after a colleague had tried to report him for allegedly abusing a child. Ashley Paul Griffith later pleaded guilty to hundreds of charges of rape and sexual abuse. That exclusive is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. The Electrical Trades Union is pushing for a 20% pay rise for sparkies ahead of the federal election. Plus, construction workers around the country will put their tools down this week to attend rallies protesting the government's forced takeover of the CFMEU. A 3,000-page Royal Commission report has recommended starting from scratch to curb veteran suicides and clamp down on sexual violence in the Defence Force. Today, we meet some of the people devastated by Defence's failures and find out if this really means meaningful change. Andrew Perry was a sniper in charge of keeping our troops safe on bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is his wife, Benita Perry, giving evidence at the Royal Commission into veteran suicide.
He was so funny. He was the funniest man in the world. When he was working, he could be quite black and white, but when he let his hair down and his guard down, he was just hysterical. There was never a day that you got out of bed without having laughed.
Benita's daughter, Kamaya Alexander, was a toddler when Andrew became her stepdad, someone she loved a lot. As she grew older, Kamaya noticed some of Andrew's personality traits, in particular that he would either be seeking total control of a situation or would be laughing and joking. She put the stress down in part to his sadness over the loss of contact with children from a previous relationship. She was in her early teens when, for the first time, the stress of Andrew's military deployments became clear.
We were on a boat with friends and I noticed that fireworks had gone off, and Andrew responded with yelling at the fireworks and saying, "Don't you know that people have been to war?" And he actually broke down in tears.
Kamaya was in no doubt it was his war service that had left Andrew in severe distress.
He was unfortunately very honest about how you would have to do your rounds and around base, monitoring everything. And he had a group of children no older than 10 coming up to him and saying, "I want you to go check out, there's something down there that I think needs to be looked at." And he's like, "Well, you walk in front." And he said to me that at that point he had zero regard for their life. If there was a bomb that they were trying to lead him to, he was going to make sure that they got hit first. And, going from zero regard to their life to absolute regard for his team, he could differentiate between, your life not worth saving, these ones are absolute paramount. And he himself, unfortunately, became one of those that, it's not paramount.
When Kamaya was aged between 16 and 18, Andrew attempted to end his life 7 times. After the second attempt, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and severe anxiety.
He no longer cared for safety. It was like one day went out to Corroboree Billabong and he was chasing crocodiles because he wanted them to eat him. He was just doing all these risky things. He could sleep for days when the depression was really bad, or he could just sit there and do nothing.
In 2015, Andrew died by suicide. Bonnie Perry said she had tried with no success to get help for Andrew. She said he was badly mismanaged by the Australian Defence Force. Bonnie said there was a shroud of secrecy about mental health problems. She said Defence sent senior officers to visit him in hospital instead of his mates, and that he wasn't helped to access a pension, which left him feeling terrified about not being able to support his family. She said it took 6 months for him to get mental health treatment in the first place, and that he was treated with a lack of compassion.
I just don't understand how the ADF can see all those suicide attempts. You know, how many red flags do you want? You know, a guy shouldn't be successful on his 8th attempt. It's crazy.
She described this conversation with a senior medical officer who discharged Andrew from hospital after one of his suicide attempts.
I just said, how come Andrew's home? And he said, excuse my language, but he said, Bonnie, he's not a threat to himself or to take his life. He said, I just told him he's a shit husband that really needs to learn how to treat women better. I told him that I wanted him to go for 5 days, not contact you, and go away and have a good hard think about things. And then at 8:30, the police car rocked up out the front and I knew. As soon as I saw him, I said, he's gone, isn't he? And they said, yes, we've just found his body.
That story is part of the catalyst for a shocking report tabled in federal parliament. It found 1,677 serving and ex-serving defence personnel died by suicide between 1997 and 2021. That's more than 20 times the number killed in active duty over the same period. The Royal Commission found deep problems with both Defence and the Department of Veterans Affairs and recommended a new agency within Veterans Affairs to actively help outgoing defence personnel, to support them into a new life, to access the services that are available and support them and their families to stay alive.
It's a shocking report, Claire, and it shines a light on what's a terrible national tragedy.
Jo Kelly is the Australian's National Affairs Editor. The report was commissioned by the Morrison government under pressure from veterans' bereaved families, and now it's the Albanese government which will have to handle the response.
We want to work across the parliament on these issues and do what we can to ensure that just as our veterans and defence personnel step up for our country, we have an obligation to step up for them.
I look forward to doing what we can on this side to work in good nature and with honour with the Minister to make sure whatever can be done as quickly and as properly as possible and to the best of our ability.
The Labor Party and the Coalition believes there is a significant problem, that this is a national failing, that governments of Labor and Conservative characteristics have let down veterans in the past. They've been let down by Defence, they've been let down by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it must be fixed. That's very encouraging. But the second point is getting on with the job now. We'll need to give the government some time to devise its response and its solution, and we'll get an idea of what that is in the not too distant future. Coming up,
Defence's sexual violence problem. Subscribers to The Australian get access to this kind of in-depth reporting and analysis 24/7. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break.
So I guess my story starts back in a little country town where I was looking for opportunities to have a career, get something outside of a small country town. And one day, one of those Defence Force recruitment vans pulled up in the main street. And I took one look at it and went, that's for me. This is my ticket out of town.
That's the voice of Danny Liversidge. He's describing how in 1988, he said goodbye to his tiny hometown of Daylesford in Victoria and set off for what he hoped would be a long career in the Air Force.
My dad was very proud of me. He was very proud of me joining, and he was very proud to be there that day, as was my whole family and friends, to see me graduate.
Danny became known as the 20-year man among his fellow airmen because of his aspiration to retire at age 42 with a full military pension. But less than 2 years after celebrating his graduation, Danny would be discharged from Defence. Danny is gay, which was unacceptable under the Defence Act, legislation that was drafted in 1903 and was still in effect in the late 80s and early 90s. An excerpt of the Act is being read by a voice actor.
Homosexual behaviour is not accepted or condoned in the Defence Force. Members can be and are regularly discharged for a variety of reasons not listed in the DFDA. ADF policy is that members who engage in consenting homosexual behaviour be treated in a similar fashion, sympathetically and with discretion.
Danny Liversidge had been observed visiting gay bars in and around Melbourne, and so he was hauled in for an interview and asked to explain himself.
Eventually their questioning got down to, LAC Liversidge, are you a homosexual? And it was the very first time I ever said it out loud, yes, I believe I'm a homosexual. They forced me to put a tag on myself, which I wasn't prepared at that stage to put that tag on myself.
It was a traumatic experience.
And I'm sitting there terrified, absolutely terrified. I've been humiliated. I'm feeling absolutely ashamed of myself. I hate myself for this aspect of myself that I've just been forced to put a tag on by someone else sitting on a table with 4 people. And it got worse from there in. Didn't get better.
Danny was told homosexuality was incompatible with military service. Senior personnel said he'd be outed, dishonourably discharged, and his training records would be withheld if he didn't leave then and there of his own volition.
And they effectively told the 20-year man that your career is over, and here are your 3 terrible options. One's not so bad, one's really bad, and one's just the go-nowhere option. And threatening dishonourable discharge and withholding of the records was apparently their sympathetic way of dealing with the homosexual in the Air Force.
Danny lived on base, so he lost his job and his home. He didn't have time to say goodbye to his friends or explain what was happening, and he wasn't allowed to keep any insignia issued over the course of his service. With no support and nowhere to go, he slept the next 2 nights in his car. What followed was a cycle of depression, anxiety, substance use and suicidal ideation.
At that point in time, I'd gone from being a loyal, committed, enthusiastic member of the Air Force to jobless, unemployed, homeless, living in my car, surrounded by possessions in the space of less than 2 weeks. That was a lot for a 23-year-old to be dealing with at that point in time, that your whole career's gone up in smoke in 2 weeks and you're now living in your car on the side of a street. That's what they did to me.
The ban on gay and lesbian personnel in the ADF was lifted by the Keating government in 1992, just 2 years after Danny Liversidge was bounced out of the force. It took 3 decades for his story to be heard at the Royal Commission and, hopefully, for change to follow. One of the report's most stark findings is that this problem is not just about suicide. It's the physical safety of personnel serving today in military jobs. Here's Joe Kelly.
There is a problem with sexual violence in the ADF, the majority of which is obviously perpetrated by men. But the report says this is a highly concerning development. It says that close to 800 sexual assaults were reported in the ADF over the past 5 years. And Defence estimates that 60% of sexual assaults are not reported at all. And there were multiple submissions to this Royal Commission from victims, which included both historic and contemporary accounts of being gang raped, including by fellow serving members of the ADF. So this is shocking. It's completely unacceptable. The report goes into detail about the effect that this kind of sexual violence has on serving and ex-serving members. And the report has actually also recommended a further inquiry into sexual violence within ADF.
Joe Kelly is the Australian's National Affairs Editor. Thanks for joining us on The Front, and please join our subscribers at theaustralian.com.au.